So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the EPC Weekly Update, our weekly look at the key developments on COVID-19 and the implications for Europe's economy, society, its global role, and EU politics in general. My name is Jackie Davis. I have the privilege of moderating these weekly sessions. With me, as every week, I have Janis Emmanouilidis, the Director of Studies at the European Policy Centre, and Fabian Zuleeg, who is, of course, the Chief Executive of the EPC. And for the first half of our conversation, where we're going to discuss the proposals unveiled by Germany and France this week for a European recovery programme, delighted to welcome EPC Policy Analyst Marta Pilati. And later on, to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the single market and on EU industrial policy, we're going to be joined by another EPC Policy Analyst, Johan Bjerkum. So a warm welcome to you all. It's a totally interactive conversation, as every week, based on questions from me and then from all of you. And I would ask if you could limit yourself in the first half to questions about the recovery programme generally and what we've discussed there. And then in the second half, as I say, the focus there will be on single market and industrial policy. Housekeeping notes for those who are joining us for the first time or are using multiple platforms and can't remember where the question buttons are on this particular one. I get very confused. I'm sure all of you do too. Your microphones are muted at the moment. If you want to ask a question when I open up to the floor, click on the hand-shaped button on the right if you want to ask a question, and I will unmute you when I give you the floor. Or you can write your question. Just click on the enter a question button, write it, hit enter. Fairly simple. And can I remind you, please, short questions would be much appreciated so I can see at a glance what you want to know and who you want to know it from. Just to mention, we have nearly 200 people watching today, so we may not be able to answer all your questions, but we do try afterwards to come back to you in writing on any questions we didn't get a chance to tackle during this hour. So let's get underway. And as I say, we're going to start with the latest developments in relation to the recovery programme. That dramatic announcement on Monday by Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel of a 500 billion euro recovery fund. Marta, just so we know exactly what this is and how it fits into this debate that's been going on for weeks about the Multiannual Financial Framework, the new proposals commission, can you just, to set some context for our discussion, explain to us exactly, or as far as we know, what they are proposing?
Thanks, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. Yes, so this proposal would entail the Commission borrowing 500 billion euros on financial markets, backed by a EU budget guarantee, and then would disburse this money to member states based on grants. There will be a binding repayment plan to be discussed, and this money would be disbursed through EU budget programs. So what are the main takeaways of all of this? First, this is effectively EU common debt. The EU would issue debt on financial markets, and the EU would be held liable to repay this debt back, which importantly will not show up on national accounts. So this is the first major big breakthrough, which we might see some countries would not necessarily agree with. Second, it would be disbursed by grants, and here is where Germany changed its mind quite significantly, because this will not be given to member states as loans, but grants. So the recipients will not necessarily have to pay back the full amount. Third, importantly, it is disbursed based on needs. So this is a complete change of logic, for example, compared to the EU budget, which entails a sort of net balance, juste retour kind of logic, for which member states would pay and get back that an amount as close as possible to be the same. So this is a completely different nature, and it would be redistributed. So the proposal entails that there will be a transfer towards those areas that would need it the most. And this is, of course, up to discussion the amount of this because the repayment conditions have not been clearly defined. There has been some indication, for example, that the repayment could be based on each member state would pay back its share, a share which is the same as the EU total GDP. And that's where the difference would make it a transfer. I'll make an example. So if Italy, let's assume it receives 20% of EU recovery fund money, this is an assumption based on some criteria that will have to be defined. This is a 100 billion. If it will be paid back only a share that is the same as the share of the EU GNI, that's 13% approximately, so 65 billion. The difference, 35, that's a pure transfer. And this logic is completely new and we have never seen this before. So of course there are no open questions, many actually, which will be the subject of negotiations at political level. The main ones are the following. First, the repayment modalities, as I mentioned. These repayment based on share of EU GDP could be an option, but importantly, the proposals also leaves a door open to new own resources. They explicitly mentioned digital activities taxation and common consolidated corporate tax base, possibly hinting to the fact that this should be put in place and be used at least in part to repay the debt. Second, open question, the allocation criteria. How will it be decided? How much money to give to which member states? Will it be based on health criteria, COVID-related number of deaths or cases, or will it be an economic criteria? Here, I think it's important that it's a combination of both, because we see, for example, a country like Greece has a relatively low health impact when it comes to COVID-19 related deaths, for example, but it is projected to be one of the countries suffering the most in terms of economic impact. So if the recovery funds recover it, then yes, here we are with a combination of this. And lastly, how is this money disbursed? And here there are two main points. One is the link to the EU budget programs, and the second is conditionality. Conditionality will be one of the interesting points to follow. The proposal explicitly said that the country should commit to sound economic policy and an ambitious reform agenda. Now, this is very broad on purpose, of course, and here we'll see where the negotiations go. Okay. This is importantly, sorry.
Very briefly, if you would now.
Yes, there's a lot to cover, but we'll see what the conditionalities implies and then the link to programs. Here, what I would expect is that the first, there will be a part of it which is given directly to national governments to be spent on some sort of agreed investment priorities, whether it's infrastructure, health, education, skills, and so on, tourism, recreational activities. Then I think there will be some money given directly to regions, and this is where there could be a link to the cohesion top-up that has been announced by Ursula von der Leyen last week. So some money directly to most affected regions. And lastly, strengthening some programs like Horizon, Rescue, SME support, and so on.
Thank you. Lots of very rich detail there, lots to discuss, and we will, of course, know more, hopefully, next week when the Commission publishes its proposals for the MFF, and particularly that link between the MFF and this programme and how it works. But can I ask, Janis and Fabian, this has been described by some people as Europe's Hamiltonian moment. They're referring here to the first US Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who in 1790 made the decision that the federal government would assume the debts of the states from the American War of Independence, i.e. that moment when you came to that common debt that Marta was talking about. Janis, is it Europe's Hamiltonian moment?
I don't think so. I think it is an important moment. It was a very strong signal from the Germans and the French. It was a necessary signal because you needed this compromise in order to actually move forward towards the Commission proposal, then actually work on getting a compromise among the EU27. And for that, you needed Paris and Berlin to be on the same page. So it is important. It is a strong signal. But I wouldn't say that this is the Hamiltonian moment. One, it is very crisis-oriented. It is targeted. It is something which will be temporary. And I think that all makes sense if you want to get an agreement among the EU 27, because as Marta was already alluding to, there are a lot of things which still need to be settled, and there are a lot of differences between the member states. So we don't know at the end of the day what the compromise will look like. There are many, many questions. Marta mentioned a good number of them, but there are even more than that. So this was important. It is key in terms of finding a solution now, finding a compromise now, which in itself is important to avoid the most negative scenario you could think of in terms of the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. So this is actually big. But Hamiltonian would suggest that everything will begin to be different from now on. And I don't think that this will be the case. Yes, it has a strong effect, but it's not the moment where everything changes. I don't think so. And by the way, I think that if you now have a debate, and also the German finance minister mentioned the Hamiltonian moment in an interview yesterday he gave to the Zeit, it creates the impression that you're actually moving towards the United States of Europe. And I think this is not what we need now. We have a concrete crisis in front of us. We need to find concrete ways of dealing with it. And we shouldn't now have a debate which is a teleological debate about the finality of European integration, which is abstract. We've had that in the past. And it doesn't lead us to a lot. So I think we should not overrate what has happened, although it's important, and we should not go too far in interpreting it, because it might even hamper finding a compromise among them.
So I think you're already answering one of the questions coming from our audience straight away, which is to what extent the proposal will change the economic and monetary governance of the EU. From what you're saying, not significantly in the long term, but maybe we can come back on that later. Fabian, so Janis arguing it's not a Hamiltonian moment. The French finance minister, among others, described it as a historic step for France, for Germany, and for the European Union. Where do you lie on the spectrum of how dramatic this is? And could you please just tell me what you think in terms of the politics of whether we can get agreement? I mean, traditionally in the EU, France and Germany, when they came up with a proposal and were able to agree, the rest fell into line. Do you think we're going to see that again now? Or do you think the noises we're hearing, for example, from Sebastian Kurz in Austria about, no, it's grants, not it's loans, not grants? Do you think there's going to be serious resistance to this? How do you read the politics of the situation now?
I mean, I think firstly, it's important to emphasize the positives of this. We have been calling for Franco-German leadership for a very long time. We have been hoping that, in particular, there would be a response from Germany to some of the proposals which have been coming out from France under President Macron. We have asked for unconditional solidarity. We've asked for grant funding. We've asked to make sure that whatever is being done now doesn't add to the national debt of the countries which are already deeply indebted. And we've asked for a significant crisis response, which does actually address the scale of the problem which we are facing. And whatever details we still have to decide on, this proposal goes a long way in that direction. Now, the big question is, are we going to get the political agreement to get it through? Are we going to have a situation where all of the countries are happy with it? And that includes the countries which I would say have taken in the past absolutist positions on both sides of the debate. Those who have said there has to be a much more limited program, it has to be loans rather than grants, but also those who have said we should be mutualizing debt at a much greater scale, not something which is just focused on the crisis. So there has to be a compromise in the middle. This is what we are going to see over the next weeks. So I'm afraid I can't say it's going to go through. The domestic politics hasn't stopped, and that means that the politics at the European level which are always very toxic when it comes to money, when it comes to contributions to the EU budget, that is going to continue. But the reality is we have something on the table now, and it will become increasingly difficult for countries to say no to it unless they can offer an alternative. What is the option which could be on the table, which they would support? Just simply going to say no when the biggest no-sayer has now put something on the table is going to be politically increasingly difficult.
But watch this space, because we have heard suggestions from the Frugal Four that they will come up with their own version of the proposal in the next few days. So something we're going to come back to. But Marta, one brief question linked to what Fabian was just talking about, and that's Italy. And whether, you know, we've seen this dramatic drop in support for the European Union in Italy, a very strong sense of having been let down, and that what is Europe for question. Do you think the size of this, the ambition of this, might be enough to turn that round, and therefore we get the Italian government on board enthusiastically and the public follow? And a second question, so briefly on that, and then in terms of the European Commission, when we look back to what Ursula von der Leyen said last week in her speech to the Parliament and look forward to the proposals next week, how do you see the link between this programme and what the Commission has been working on already? And what it will do? Will it be channeled through the MFF? Will it be done in some other way? So quick thought on Italy, and then to that question, if you would.
Yes, thanks. I think what's going on in Italy is unfortunately a rolling snowball that has started 10 years ago. The fact of feeling not helped or left behind by the European partners when it needs. I think that has started with the economic and financial crisis, and it's continued with the asylum seeker and refugee crisis, and now we see it again with a health crisis. So I think the underpinning fundamental resentment, it's not something new. It's something that unfortunately it's being exacerbated towards the years, and that's also because of chance, of course. The government seems happy with what the Franco-German proposal puts on the table. Of course, the doomsayers will always say it's not enough, and it comes with too strict conditionalities, although we don't know them at the moment. I think a lot will matter on communication efforts. Here, communication is key.
Okay. And on this question of the Commission.
Yes, so I think there is overall agreement now that this recovery fund will be somewhat linked to the MFF. The Parliament is asking for it, now France and Germany as well. The Commission, I find also, Ursula von der Leyen has said that last week, and I find it hard to believe that they would go for an intergovernmental agreement which ignores the Parliament scrutiny, for example. I think the main question will be how the programs will be restructured. The overall discussion seems to be that the MFF as it is today will be slightly modified, but will more or less be kept the same with the recovery fund on top. And if I might add something on the negotiations, we will see, I think, countries negotiating trade-offs between the recovery fund and the MFF. We already saw that Poland is asking now for larger common agricultural policy funding, and I think we will see demands from the Central Eastern European countries to strengthen cohesion and agriculture in exchange for their approval to the recovery fund.
Which could run counter to this idea that you allocate the money to the countries hit hardest by COVID and who need it most. So already we begin to see that political battle. Janis, you wanted to come in here, and a question to you really about the tactics here as well. This has been announced. We were waiting for the Commission proposals. Instead, we got this dramatic announcement from the French and Germans, that joint video press conference by Macron and Merkel. Does this mean that effectively the Commission has been sidelined, or is this clever tactics to say we have a Franco-German proposal, and as I said before, traditionally that opens the gates, Germany making this big leap forward, and Germany about to take the presidency, so potentially, you know, having to push this through. So was it sensible tactics, or a sign that the Commission has been severely weakened and sidelined?
No, I think this was the right thing to do. as we were saying before, you needed an agreement between Paris and Berlin to get things moving. That provides an opportunity to the Commission to come up with a proposal which reflects the ideas which France and Germany have agreed on, but will also reflect some of the ideas of others. That's what you need to look for in order to get a compromise. So I think it actually strengthens the Commission. It helps the Commission. And let's imagine if the Commission would have come forward with a proposal and nobody would have agreed to it. That would have been the worst potential outcome. So I think this was the right thing to do. Just 2 points. One is, I think what is important is not only has Paris and Berlin found an agreement, we've seen them finding agreements also in the past, but they're pushing for that agreement. You're seeing that Angela Merkel, who now is in full crisis mode, is also putting her weight behind this. She's trying to advocate in favor of it. She's having discussion with other heads of state and government yesterday with the V4, with the Visegrad countries. So she is actually subscribing not only to what has been found as a compromise, she's pushing for that. And that's not something we saw, for example, when there was an agreement at Meseberg on the future of the economic and monetary union, where actually the German government was really pushing. And then I think what is also important is that you have an idea, a proposal which is now out there, which the European Parliament can live with. This is something, it will be part of the MFF, part of the EU budget. So it is also something which the EP will be able to accommodate, support, and that's important because they have a co-say in this process.
And they've been most insistent in the last few weeks on saying, whatever you do, whatever mechanism you use, we insist on being consulted or we won't approve the MFF. So politically crucial. Fabian, from your point of view, and the fact that Germany is about to assume the presidency, could be very important here in providing that leadership role, both formally and informally, although, of course, in your presidency hat, you're supposed to be more of an honest broker here. How do you see this playing out in terms of the way, I mean, do you think Germany has, Angela Merkel has already found the landing zone with, for example, the Netherlands, and despite public tough talking, she pretty much knows she can get them on board? Or is this an attempt to effectively steamroller them? Defying them to say no to something the French and Germans have agreed. And could you say one word as well, perhaps, about the Conference on the Future of Europe? Because Angela Merkel said, and I quote, "It will take place in a different way because of the crisis. We need to talk about what Europe could not achieve sufficiently and what the future will be." What's she hinting at there, do you think?
I think when it comes to the German presidency, yes, it is the role of an honest broker, but I think in this case, especially when it comes to the Multiannual Financial Framework, it helps enormously if the honest broker is also the one who will have to put up the biggest amount. And that, in the end, is going to be what swings from non-agreement to agreement. We will have something very substantive from Germany on the table. A little footnote on that, I think we need to be careful and watch the German debate as well. This will not be uncontroversial. Yes, the government is behind this. Merkel is pushing for it very strongly. But we have in the past also seen parts of her own party being more skeptical. And we have seen very recently that there are potentially also legal challenges to some of this. So we need to be sure that these proposals actually survive the German debate before we can have anything on the European level. But if we do have that, I think it's going to be incredibly hard for the Frugal Four to simply say no. It has to be something substantive which is on the table. On the Conference on the Future of Europe, I'll leave that to Janis, given that he's done a lot of work on that. But clearly, there are changes which will have to be made, both in terms of the process of it, but more importantly, I think in terms of the content, because the post-COVID-19 world is not the same as the pre-COVID-19 world.
Okay, lots of questions coming in. So Janis, very briefly on the Conference of Europe, she's pointing, it seems to me, to a bigger discussion than maybe we might have seen.
Yes, that's what she's doing, and she's doing it together with Macron. So on this issue, they're now pushing in this direction, which is interesting because before COVID-19 crisis, before it broke out, actually not a lot of people were interested in the Conference on the Future of Europe. In the first phases of the crisis, there was no reference to it, and now it's coming back. You see that there is more interest on the issues to be discussed in the context of the conference, where we don't know actually what it will be about, what the content will look like, but politically it's getting a boost. But let's not forget, the Conference on the Future of Europe will only start maybe in the second half of this year, maybe even the first half of 2021, and it shall last until 2022. So that's after Merkel will have left office.
Thank you. 2 questions, Marta. I need to bring the questions in because we only have 5 minutes left for this part of the discussion. 2 relating to the European semester. Is the link of the recovery plan to the European semester a good idea? That from Joe Leinen. And given that we are on the path of big EU level interventions, will we require a rapid overhaul of the European semester and its surveillance role, especially in relation to how the single market is protected? We're going to come back on the single market later, but that question from Alison Hunter. So 2 questions relating to the link between this and the European semester. Can you help us with those, Marta?
Yes, so the European semester was brought up by von der Leyen last week when she said that the recovery instrument will be in this framework. I think that links pretty well to those conditionalities on sound reform and economic policy that the Franco-German proposal argues for. I think this could be a good idea in the sense that the European semester is a known mechanism that member states are used to work with. And I think there will have to be some conditionalities, especially if we want agreement at EU27 level. The fact that these conditionalities would be in the framework of the European semester instead of new ad hoc, new sorts of conditions, I think that could be a good idea.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Verena Ringler. Hang on. Oh, sorry, I clicked the wrong button. Verena, can you put your hand up again? Sorry, I clicked the wrong button here. Thank you so much. You have the floor, Verena Ringler. Hello? I'm afraid we can't hear you, Verena.
Hello, good morning.
There we are. Yes, you're there. Your question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marta, I have one question. Where is the Green Deal in terms of sort of factors or even conditionality in all this? Thank you.
Marta.
Yes, good point. The green transition is mentioned in the Franco-German proposal, but details are missing. We will have to see really what the programs that will disburse the recovery fund money will be made of. What I imagine is that there will be some sort of list of green investment that member states can finance with recovery fund, whether that's research and innovation, whether that's industrial greening. I think there will be some sort of link clearly because that's the EU's priority, but at the moment that's quite missing, I'm afraid, but I imagine that will be the part that is up for discussion.
Thank you very much.
Just briefly,
one very quick question also to you, Fabian, just last one we're going to be able to take in this part. Industrial policy and grants is a noble idea, says Just van Issel, but the main question is, how do you get investors on board? Do you foresee new public-private transborder alliances in the framework of the proposal? But both points, if you would, Fabian.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the conditionality, just to say that if we want to spend this money, the conditionality will have to be rather loose. It's an enormous amount of money to push out. If it becomes a bureaucratic exercise where things will need to be checked in detail, it's not going to happen. So I think we need the conditionalities also in the German political context. It cannot just be money which is transferred. There has to be a link, but in reality, I think certainly at the beginning, it will be rather high level in terms of conditionality. The one to watch, I think, is the rule of law conditionality. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, because also it is very important within the political context of the German debate. And here the question, of course, is are we going to get unanimous agreement also from those countries which might be affected by this moving forward. I think in terms of how this is going to work, how that links into investment, we at the moment have a very broad idea, which will have to be much more concrete going forward. But for that, we first need to have the political agreement that this will fly. I think what we have here at the moment is a proposal for EU borrowing, which is backed by the EU budget and by extension by the member state. So in the end, I think it will not be difficult to raise money under those conditions. But if this becomes a form of loan instrument or a form of public-private partnership where you want to have private investment coming in, then I think that could be much more difficult in the current environment.
Okay,
so
we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in future weeks. We need to move on now to our next topic. So thank you very much, Marta. Great to have you with us. And I think you'll be joining us again next week for the weekly update back in its regular slot on Friday to talk about those proposals from the Commission once we've actually got them. So thank you for today and see you again next week.
You.
So
Thanks,
as well as the proposals for the Recovery Fund, the Franco-German proposals contain three other pillars: strengthening the health sector, boosting what they call the modernization of the economy, and that includes the Green Deal. We've had a question about that and all of that, and strengthening European sovereignty, and a swift return, as it puts it, to Schengen and the internal market. So joining us now to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the single market and the EU's industrial strategy, delighted to welcome Johan Bjerkum. A very warm welcome, Johan. Great to have you with us. Just to set some context for this part of the conversation, what impact has the crisis had on the single market so far? Where do you think the EU has been successful in protecting it? And where has the level playing field that underpins it been significantly undermined?
Thanks, Jackie, and I'll try to respond to the questions. Firstly, the effect on the single market has, of course, been huge. We've seen in the first reaction to the crisis that most member states have closed down their borders, and obviously the single market was put on hold for quite many weeks. To a certain extent, the single market is still put on hold. We have obviously taken a break in free circulation. Free movement is not the same as it was before, obviously, so that has been done with good reasons. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize that actually the single market and single market policies have been at the core of the Commission's response to the crisis. And we've spoken a lot about what the ECB has done. We've spoken a lot about now the Franco-German proposal, but I think it's also important to realize that in areas where the Commission has important competence, it's been able to act quite swiftly, actually, in many areas. And just to give you a few examples, we all know that in the beginning of the crisis, member states reacted quite emotionally, maybe, with just putting up national export bans on medical supplies, of course, fearing that these might go out and they might be needed in the member states. The EU has contributed to lifting those national export bans gradually, and measures have been taken there. The EU and the Commission has also put up green lanes at the borders between the member states in order to make sure that where it's needed, free movement of goods and essential services can continue. Europe is tackling this crisis together. It's important that essential goods and services can go to the countries where it's the most needed rapidly, so the barriers have been kept open there. A clearinghouse has been established in the Commission to make sure that medical equipment goes to the areas where it's the most needed. The EU member states have started to procure medical supplies jointly. Okay. For example, so haven't seen to this extent in the US.
Lots of areas where there has been a real success in defending and protecting the single market, but also a growing concern about an unleveling of the playing field, particularly, for example, in response to the relaxation of the state aid rules.
Yes, indeed, and that has been an important element of the Commission's response as well. There's been a temporary framework put in place in order to accept state aid rules. State aid measures, but obviously this has created quite some friction. We know that over 50% of the grant of the measures that have been allowed have been going to Germany. That's a big issue, and secondly to France. It's a big issue, especially for the Southern European countries, the most touched by the crisis, that feel that they don't have the same capacity to respond to the crisis. And obviously, that's why it's important to link that to the Franco-German proposal of yesterday, which also mentions single market industrial policy, where I think the Germans and the French have realized rightly that they also need to make sure that there's a financial support mechanism put at the European level. It's not enough to just react in your own member state. We need to move towards European solutions on that.
So if I could just pick up on that, and Fabian, a cynic might say, this is all, the fact that Germany has moved so dramatically on the issue of common debt is precisely because of this problem. Because they are account, as Johan was just saying, for 51% of all state aids approved since the crisis began. Some countries were down at 0.5, 1.4, tiny amounts. And they want to go on being able to do that. They're calling for revisiting the state aid rules and the competition rules. Am I being unduly cynical to say there might be some sort of quid pro quo going on here, as Johan also, I think, just pointed to?
Yeah, I think we might find that mutualization of debt is easier than communitization of state aid. We are in a situation where state aid clearly is the core response at the national level in some countries, and where it is also very hard to imagine that the Commission in this crisis situation would say to member states, no, you cannot use national funds to support your industry. That would be politically completely unacceptable. But clearly, we are also seeing how distortive this is, given that some countries have far greater means. And I think this is going to be an even bigger problem. And I'm not sure that the Franco-German proposal addresses this problem, because in the end, what we are going to see, given the structural changes which come with this crisis, is that there will be restructuring in a number of important sectors. We will have excess capacity, as I've mentioned before on this weekly update. We will have more supply than we have demand for, not only within Europe, but also globally. So what happens, for example, if you are supporting airlines, if you're supporting the tourism industry, and one country is able to do that longer, is able to do that to a greater extent than other countries, you could have a very real distortion over the long term of what sectors and what companies survive and which ones don't. So the solution, I'm afraid, is the one which politically is probably the most difficult, is we have to do it together at the European level, rather than leaving it up to each member state to do whatever they can because of the differences between them.
Thank you. Janis, brief one if you would, because lots more to discuss and time is against us.
No, I think that this is really a key point, and it strongly links to what we were discussing with respect to the Franco-German proposals, the recovery fund. There is in Germany now a strong understanding that what is happening in terms of the undermining of the single market because of state aid being so much concentrated in Germany, that this actually is a problem. And I think that's also a reason why you see some who have been skeptical with respect to, for example, in the past Euro bonds or common debt, now understanding that if we don't actually get our act together and with respect to the recovery fund, this might undermine Germany's role, it might undermine the common market. That would do us a lot of harm. So this is a very strong political argument, even in those who have been conservative about what needs to be done at European level in countries like Germany. And I think we should not underestimate this.
Okay, Johan, I know you want to react to that, but we want to move us on a little bit and come back to something you wrote in a paper a few weeks ago about what we do in terms of reinstating the single market. And you said, and I quote, the EU should be as forceful in reinstating the single market as it was when putting it on hold. Indeed, you said it needed to do more than just reinstate it, it needed to improve it. In practice, what does that mean? Obviously, there's this issue, but also other issues I think you raised.
Well, firstly, I think we really need to realize that obviously the single market after COVID will not be the same as it was before. We will see a massive intervention of states in the economy, state aids, not only in Europe, but also in the world generally. And overall, industrial policy will be used much more actively to defend national interests. And I think what we need to realize is that European countries and European member states will be even more reliant on their own single market to prosper, especially in the first months when we move out of the crisis. The value chains will have to be put in place, back in place, and be working in Europe, firstly, which is crucial in order to be global competitive on the long term. So the single market will be crucial in the first stages and on the long term. And I think to link back to what Janis was just saying, I think the Germans are starting to realize this, not only because they're now supporting their economy with state aids, but also because they realize that value chains in Europe are European in the single market. And if they have an industrial product today is not produced in one single country, it's usually produced in several countries, and there are elements coming from other countries as well. German industry will be dependent on a well-functioning Spanish, Italian economy as well. And it's not only a question of solidarity, helping the South because we want to be nice to them. It's really a question of fairness and the well-functioning of the single market. And I think that is important proposal. Maybe it's not, but it's already a good start. And I think we really need to make sure that it's put up and running as quickly as possible, and that funds really are going to the countries that need it the most. Absolutely. In order for this leveling playing field to.
Can I also just quickly follow up before I come to Janis and Fabian on the industrial strategy? Is it going to need to be dramatically changed in light of the crisis, or is it fundamentally okay as it is and may need some tinkering, but is basically, it's just a question of implementing it? How do you see the way forward on that?
Well, you know, what's really interesting is that I think everyone is saying how with COVID we should think radically differently and we should change the way we've been doing things. But actually, if you look at what France and Germany were saying yesterday on industrial policy, on the single market, but especially on competition rules and industrial policy, these are things that they have been saying for quite some time. So I think the COVID crisis is more reinforcing policy preferences that already exist. But obviously, I think that when it comes to the EU's industrial strategy that was actually proposed just before we went into lockdown, I don't think the document as such needs to be redrafted and reviewed. I don't think it's time for the Commission to totally review all its strategic documents like the Green Deal, like industrial strategy or the data strategy. I think those documents are okay the way they are. What we really need to focus on is the measures and the actions that are supposed to be put in place behind those strategies. And it's possible that in some areas, like the subsidies and proposal that was discussed by Vestager, we might have to wait a little bit longer until proposing that, because obviously, how do we tell the rest of the world to stop subsidizing their industry if we also have subsidies or aids in Europe? Things like screening of foreign investments, boosting alliances and IPCIs should be boosted even more than before.
Yeah, and you raised a very important question there, because on the global dimension of all of this, Fabian, there is a lot of emphasis also on this more assertive trade and industrial policy, strengthening European sovereignty. Again, a debate that we were having before the crisis, but has really been stepped up. And Macron in particular talking about the creation of European champions. You know, do we need to do more to enable that, and through revisions of the competition rules and so on? How do you see the impact of all of this on our relations with other players, and how dramatically things might change? Because Johan pointing out there, if we start doing things that we say they shouldn't, they're going to respond. I'm thinking Boeing, Airbus, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the key dimensions of the European response, which we will have to take into account. We will have an issue globally, both with countries which are already prone to do this. So countries, for example, with state-owned enterprises, which are receiving a number of implicit support schemes that from a European perspective, it will be much harder to call that kind of behavior out because we will be distorting the level playing field by supporting our companies. But it will also be a question with those who will push for a lesser intervention, who will claim that the state aid which Europe is using is simply not allowed in international trade. And I think we could be in a situation where the multilateral institutions, for example, are further weakened because of these kind of conflicts. So certainly, I think on the global level, it will not get easier. But I think just to reinforce what Johan was saying on the industrial strategy, with the industrial strategy, we actually recognized that something had changed. So this is a new strategy. It's in many ways a very new approach of doing this at the European level, which we didn't have beforehand. So in that sense, it is still the right strategy to deal with the post-COVID-19 world. Although I think what we need to look at is the means which are behind that strategy. I think the objectives are still right. The kind of broader aim which we have behind this is still right. But I think we will have to start thinking very differently. And in particular, we have to find a way of bringing together the national reactions at the European level. So when it comes to national champions, for example, is this really about having European champions, or is it about having French champions, which then also happen to be European champions?
I accuse myself of being cynical, but a very good point. Janis, you want to come in and then I'll go out to the room. Oh, sorry, Fabian.
But just to say, this is a very old debate, and just to say that I don't think that we are at the end of that debate. Yes, COVID-19 changes a lot, but we should also not forget that we have had in the past very bad experiences in Europe with providing state aid, with trying to create European champions, where a lot of money has been wasted, where there have been very significant distortions of the level playing field. So it has to be the right balance, and that balance we can only get by doing it together at the European level. The national response is just not sufficient.
Thank you. Janis, and then I'll go out to the room.
I think as a general point, I think whatever we're looking now at in terms of what the effects of the crisis is, I think as a general rule, I think that this crisis is an accelerator of trends. So things which we have already seen developing over the past months, past years, are being further enhanced. The crisis functions like a catalyst. That also goes for industrial policy, but we should not do the mistake to consider that the current situation will be the situation in 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 months' time. As the economic crisis effects really show themselves in terms of unemployment and in terms of companies shutting down, when we see these actual effects, we will be in a totally different situation. And I think we will be discussing things related to the economy, to industrial policy, to the single market in a different way as things progress and as things economically worsen. Just to give you an example with respect to the international field, there are many also in Washington, D.C., who say that we will witness a deterioration between the relations of China and the U.S. There are some who even say that we are moving towards having a cold economic war. If that happens, that has repercussions on the global economy, but it also has repercussions on how we Europeans deal with that in case it really materializes, and how we need to adapt our policies according to it. Some tough decisions will have to be taken within the European Union.
Absolutely, and there is a question actually relating to that from Andres Petersons, who says, what about suggestions to put on hold any Chinese acquisition of European countries? Is that something that is likely to happen, should be thought about? Who wants to come in on that one? Wave at me. Johan first, Fabian, quick ones if you would.
Thanks. I think this sounds very difficult because it's difficult to make a rule out of singling out one country in particular. We do know that, of course, it is a country in particular that is intervening or investing and so on. I think that's why it's important to put up a screening of foreign direct investments to begin with. At the European level, we have a new proposal that is supposed to come into place in October. We could try to see how quickly we can put that up, but also not all EU member states have such screenings in place. So they also need to make sure that that's put up. But to answer to that question, I think that it's difficult to make a rule out of that. We can more efficiently screen investments and make sure that we do take actually your decisions at European level. But making a general rule out of it, I think, is difficult.
Fabian?
I agree. Making a general rule out of this is difficult, but what we should have is European investment screening. What we have at the moment is still patchy. Some countries don't have it at all, but even if we had it in all countries, there are still differences, and we don't have a common European approach. And the reality is that I think we will be asked more to look into this, also with a view of strategic autonomy, or whatever we want to call it, technological sovereignty. There will be more sectors where this will be a concern. And that means I think we need to have a common approach, which we don't have at the moment. We have moved a bit over the last year, so there has been some progress. But I think the current crisis should actually be an impetus to go further and to have a common system across the European Union. And that, in my view, would also benefit other countries. It would benefit countries like China, because it would mean that there have to be very clear rules. There has to be the legal basis to say under what circumstances is this allowed or not. So it cannot then be abused as a protectionist measure. You will have to evidence it. And that, I think, is exactly the right approach, because the temptation would be that if we have something where we can use it essentially on a political level, then it very quickly becomes a protectionist issue rather than being truly aimed at those areas where we need to protect Europe's strategic autonomy.
Absolutely. And that links back to our discussion earlier about do as we say, not as we do. As it were, and how we make sure that in communicating this to the rest of the world, it is not seen in that way. I'm going to bring in Malcolm Harbour, who has his hand up. So Malcolm, I am attempting to open your mic, but it's not letting me. You're self-muted, Malcolm. Can you unmute yourself?
No, I'm unmuted. All right.
Hello there.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
You can hear you, Malcolm.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Yes. Well, just to say that the Single Market Roundtable of the EPC is meeting next Tuesday for a discussion on the single market. I wasn't sure whether you were going to say that anyway, but as the chairman of it, perhaps you'll allow me to promote it. But coming on to the broader question, I just want to agree very much with what Janis said about the fact that we are in a very different space, and we're going to have to wait to see how these so-called state aid measures unwind, because the nature of these job protection measures is a very different sort of state aid, as opposed to keeping uncompetitive industries there because we want local jobs. Now, there are some industries clearly which are going to have a priority. We already had the announcement in the UK this morning that Rolls-Royce Aero Engines is going to make 9,000 people redundant because of the collapse in the airliner market. Now, that's going to affect one of our key European champions, Airbus. We don't know how they're going to respond. And I want to make a bigger picture about the industrial strategy, so-called, to say I think it has to be much better integrated with the whole move we're making towards investing in innovation and indeed the Green Deal as well. I mean, what are we going to do with all the engineers in Airbus who are not going to be working on making planes because there isn't a market for air travel? But actually, we have big issues, for example, in transitional technologies to decarbonize the economy. Okay. So, I mean, my view is that we need to rethink it.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm. I have a question from Philippe de Boek. It's a very straightforward, practical question about how things work. Is Vice President Vestager the right person, due to her past in the Commission, to lead the transformation of the EU's competition and state aid policy? Do we know who is likely to do this, and is she the right person? I'm not sure whether he's indicating he thinks she is or she isn't, but can anybody pick up on that one? You're all, Johan, thank you.
No, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, this will competition rules are to be reformed. They've been put in the mandate of von der Leyen and in the letter to Vestager, so that was expected. Of course, some countries would like to see that happening much quicker, but I think at the end of the day, that the package of action on industrial policy and competition rules will have to be acceptable for all member states. So even within the Commission, we have commissioners that might feel strongly about certain things and others. But I think, we cannot forget about the interest of European consumers, which is important for Vestager. And in certain extents, maybe we need to rethink certain rules. So I think the fact that we do anyways have those differences within the Commission is only reflecting what exists in Europe.
Yeah, and interesting because Emmanuel Macron did make a reference to consumer rights when he talked about champions and suggesting, and it will have caused some alarm, I imagine, among consumer groups. He said maybe we give too much priority to that. Quite what he meant, don't know. Fabian, really brief one because we need to draw some conclusions now.
Very quickly, I think what this crisis calls for, even more than what we had before, is that we cannot think in silos, that we cannot think that different parts of the Commission will deal with this or that. What we need is an overall strategy, and then we need to adjust the policy areas towards that strategy. So this will be something, in my view, which is not one commissioner alone, which is not led by a particular service. This has to be something which goes through all of the action of the Commission and has to be led from the top in conjunction with the member states. I think this is not about European or member state, it is both of them acting together. And there, I think we need to have an overarching strategy. We need to know what we are aiming to. We need to know, for example, when we are wanting to reinstate the single market, as Johan has said, what is the plan? What is the timing for that? What are the steps we're going to take? The industrial policy, we did a lot of work on that. What we did was to underpin it with the Green Deal, with the climate change issue. When are we returning to that? Is that going to be the key strategic direction of the Commission for the next years?
Okay, and accepting the need for that overarching strategy, within that, if it's a question of setting priorities right now, because there is so much that needs to be done in response to the crisis, where would you start? Would it be for you, first we need to make sure this reinstatement of the single market and that we get this question of the state aids and how they're managed right? What for you would be the most important priority, accepting that that's within a context of a coherent, coordinated, overarching strategy? Key priority for each of you before we wrap up. Fabian, as you made that point about the strategy, I'll come to you first, then I'll come to Janis, and then I'm going to give Johan the last word.
I'm afraid I'm not going to give people the comfort to say that you can only focus on one thing. There is not just one key priority. Given the extent of the crisis, we have to act in many different areas at the same time. I think the state aid question is absolutely crucial, but we need to look at this also in terms of the different phases of this crisis. At the moment, what we have are, to a very large scale, job retention schemes where people are being kept within the jobs which they had beforehand. The key question which is going to come in the next month is how do we switch out of that, and how do we deal with the change which is going to coming back to Malcolm's point, that some of those companies where we are now supporting jobs are going to be uncompetitive going forward. They are going to be the ones which are not going to survive. So how do we make that transition at that point? That's, for me, one of the key questions which is coming up very soon.
Thank you. Janis?
I think for me, the key priority is now that we get a swift agreement on the MFF and on the recovery fund. And I mean swift in terms of making sure that actually you will be able to use the funds quickly. Because as I said earlier, we are going to be feeling the economic effects of this crisis in a couple of months, even more than we do now. And we need to have something in place to be supporting those countries, those regions, those sectors which are strongly hit. And this is important because if you don't do that, one, what we were discussing already over the past half hour, it would, if we don't get it, we would undermine the single market. And let's not forget, the single market is a strong glue for holding us together as EU27. So we need to get that right. And second, if we don't get it right and we don't get it quickly, I think we will see a further deterioration of public opinion in a good number of member states which are strongly hit, which hope that there will be support coming from the European level, and which feel disappointed about what has happened up till now. And if that disappointment increases, we are all in big trouble.
Thank you. Johan, you have the last word, your key priority.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with what has been just said. I think crucially, everything that is underpinning this is the MFF, the Recovery Fund, which is a step in a good direction. But beyond that as well, I think going back to free movement as quickly as possible in the areas where we can, because in goods, there's no reason why we have to make sure that goods flow freely for the moment. As quickly as possible, and services as well. We might have to wait a bit with the free movement of people and so on, but even there we see that countries are also waiting for tourists to come to their countries this summer. So obviously there's a willingness to be able to kickstart the economy with opening up the single market again. And also other things that were not mentioned, but I think because obviously we didn't have the time, but trade policy is absolutely crucial. I think that of course, it will be a challenge, but I think there is a possibility to take up a discussion with the US, for example, as has been suggested by Phil Hogan. And of course, the circular economy and increasingly retaining raw materials within Europe and within our single markets, as we will be more reliant on ourselves, is also absolutely crucial within the single market.
Thank you very much. And indeed, we didn't have time for everything, but we will, I hope, come back on that. I hope you will join us on a future occasion, Johan, to talk about those things in more detail as well. So thank you very much to you. Thank you, Marta, for your contribution. Thank you, Fabian and Janis. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Watch out next week for events including a policy dialogue on 1 year of Zelensky, following publication of a commentary on the Ukrainian president's first year in office, an event on single market and standardization, and one on the United States approach to the conflict in Syria and the fight against ISIS. Also publications coming up soon. We have a discussion paper on the European minimum wage, a new edition of the EPIM update on migration, asylum, Schengen, that issue we touched on and discussed in depth last week, and a discussion paper on how to counter shrinking spaces with a tax on civil liberties, and that will include some recommendations for supporting EU civil society. And I'll be back next Friday in our usual slot, 11 o'clock in the morning, with Fabian, Janis and Marta, where, assuming the Commission does publish its proposals next Wednesday, which now looks a lot more likely after the Franco-German proposals, but if all goes according to plan, the three of them and I will be back here next Friday at 11 o'clock for our regular weekly update. In the meantime, may I wish you a very enjoyable long weekend in the sunshine, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jackie. Bye.
Bye.